I welcome you all tonight, and I hand over the platform to Prof. Mandi Rukuni.
Thank you, Kevin, and welcome back everybody to the second season of DWP. Devolution, for sure, is a big story across the continent. Almost every country is talking about it or attempting to do something about it. Let me have the next slide, please. So we need to recognize this resurgence. If we look at our colonial history, generally we have reached a stage where devolution or decentralization or decongestion of government is becoming important, but it's not just Africa, it's worldwide. We're not going to go into that, but we'll touch on how this has been interpreted as important for development in other newly industrialized countries. But when you look at the literature, African scholars, although they, on balance, it would appear that devolution is not really working well at all in Africa, but scholars also agree that there is enough evidence to suggest that devolution is an idea that every African country should continue to pursue. Devolution is generally inspiring to citizens because it conjures images of real freedom down the road, in terms of seeing hopes of opening up these bureaucracies, these blockages that every country experiences, citizens experience when you deal with the central part of government. So it's a constipated system when you get to the top, into the capital cities and the central ministries. You don't get a sense that there's direct access to people by government, and vice versa. So ultimately, devolution offers the hope of local level development and implementation, which is in sync with national vision. So it is an important topic for us to discuss. You'll find that in the literature, the contemporary issues, quite a few will open up a few, but maybe the ultimate thing that most of us are looking for in devolution is actually improvement in service delivery of the public sector, of the public administration system. So, and it's a good assumption that when service delivery improves, we'll start to see development happening at a faster pace. So the real question for the 6-part series on devolution is really the question, does devolution therefore lead to development? But we'll talk later about how we have reached the stage now where devolution initially just really served the central government and most of the kind of local authority systems. But because there's greater push beyond just the local authorities to really touch on the traditional African village, the rural space, that's where we are beginning to find that there's a feeling that even the good attempts with devolution are still basically driven by Eurocentric ideas of community. And Eurocentric ideas of community where everybody ends up at a community hall and so on is quite not the way that Africans normally participate in local issues. So that we got a bit of a problem there, which I hope in the subsequent sessions we'll have a speaker focusing on specific issues such as that. So let's go on to the next slide. There are several approaches that we see on the African continent when it comes to decentralization or devolution. There are 3 major forms, and they all emanate from our colonial history, basically, because every African country, including even Ethiopia, which was never really colonized, but when we look at the nature of central government, and local authorities and below, we're still all running a Eurocentric model, which was established 4,000 years ago by the Romans and passed down to the Europeans, and the Europeans passed it down to us through colonization. But of the three forms, the three countries that have what you might call a federal type system are really Nigeria, Ethiopia, and South Africa. Although scholars would argue that it's really Nigeria which has what you might say is genuine federalism. Ethiopia and South Africa is kind of quasi-federalism because basically the decentralized provincial governments don't necessarily have the autonomy that is normally expected of a federal state, but they do have a bit more than the traditional three-tier system that is experienced in most other countries. So the rest of the continent, besides those three countries, is either continuing to run the colonial model of the two-tier system, which is central government, and then local authorities. And the local authorities usually are just divided between the metropolitan type of urban local authorities and the rural. But we are beginning to now see some countries experiment beyond that colonial model, but without necessarily going for the federal model, by putting in new tiers in between. And Kenya is a good example. They've inserted the county, which is an extremely interesting model for Africa, because all of a sudden we do have a tier which is definitely got more authority and mandate than the traditional local authority system, which was passed down to us by the colonial systems. But as I said earlier, these issues are becoming more and more interesting as Africa develops. Over the last 60 years or so that we have broken the shackles of colonialism, Africa is actually advancing, although it may not seem visible, but there are things happening in trying to figure out more appropriate forms of central and devolved government. So they are false starts in some places, but that's part of learning by doing. That's why I cite the example of South Africa here, which is one of the countries which is really constitutionally tried to devolve, only to find that it's not so easy for local authorities and provincial governments, which really never fully grasped what comes with the mandate of a devolved government. And in some instances, central government is tending to go back to review and sometimes even to try and re-centralize some of the mandates that we passed down to the lower levels. Why? Because in the end, like in the case of South Africa, if central government, provincial government, and local authority is based on the Eurocentric system, it's all based on the same political parties competing for the three levels. So it means that, like in the case of South Africa, the poorer the service delivery at provincial and local authority, the more it becomes important for the ANC to try and push for re-centralization of some of that, so that they could improve service delivery, because that's where the the votes may come from. So there's always a back and forth, like all other areas of development. Next slide, please. So if you go back to the mandates that are critical in this debate, discussion, this dialogue, and I'm hoping that future speakers will expand on these issues. I'm really calling out for all of you to, we have identified some speakers for this series, but if some of you have recommendation for others, please pass them on to the DWP staff. But you see, there are three main areas of mandate that we are playing around with. One is political mandate. How much is the political mandate power devolved from the center to the state or province and further down? And then the fiscal one is usually the most talked about. How much of the capacity of lower echelons of government to raise their own fiscus, to tax, and so on, or the extent to which the lower echelons are reliant on central government for all the fiscus. And thirdly, is just the administrative function, which usually requires not just capacity to communicate, but capacity to handle data information. So the information flow and where the information is and where the administrative data is held becomes critical. So these are the three issues that I'm hoping will be unpacked in this dialogue as we go. And these are these three areas: the political, fiscal, administrative. If you look at especially what some of the scholars are saying, is that this is dependent on a number of issues, of which probably at the top is the adherence to the subsidiarity principle, which basically says power and mandate will be transferred to lower echelons if that kind of mandate and function is better performed in terms of efficiency and effectiveness at that lower level. So, and as we know, although that's the most important principle, but it does have that inherent competition conflict when it comes to political economy. So that's one area. The second area is clarity in terms of the extent to which central government specifically would want to see more autonomy in tax revenue and other sources of revenue by lower echelons of government. And once again, there's political economy issues there. The more the lower echelons have autonomy to raise income, the more they may want to digress from if there's no coherent national vision. But where there is coherent national vision, that should actually speed up. That's why when we talk later about how other countries such as China and so on have been able to develop systems which ensure that even as a lot of mandate is devolved down, the adherence to the national vision still remains intact. So mutual accountability is also a key one. Once again, it goes all the way back to not just the administrative functions. It goes it also is mutual accountability between central government and lower echelons of government, mean that there is sufficient understanding of roles, responsibilities, means of accounting to each other, both back and forth, so that you just don't have the lower echelons being accountable to central government, but also central government being accountable to the lower echelons. So all these, as I said earlier, the kind of determinants of the extent to which the political, fiscal, administrative aspects impact on the type of devolution. And as we look at the evolution of devolution on the continent, what is also becoming clear is that the real desires, objectives that are driving devolution are also evolving. And at the moment, the main motives, when you actually see across the countries, what the main motives are, they differ quite a bit, although the three motives will apply, will be in almost every instance, but with different priorities. First is improved service delivery appears to be a key motive for decentralization or devolution. And then democracy or democratic practices and participation, inclusive type of participation is another motive. Then the third one will be actually efficiency of government, both in terms of reduction of costs as well as improvement of performance. But as I say, you'll find that although the three would probably always be important, in some instances, the political aspect of democracy would outweigh everything else. In others, where that's not so important, development becomes important. So I thought that as we prepare to have more presentations by other experts on this topic from across the continent, one of the things I wanted to do was also relying heavily from what I've gleaned from the gurus in this topic. I pulled out this general historical evolution from the literature, and it would suggest, so that we do have a kind of a historical reference in the way we are evolving around this issue of decentralization. If you go, so this summarizes the pre-colonial period would be the first thing that we'll focus on. Then as we go into colonization, and then transitioning out of colonization, out of the so-called Second World War, and then the post-independence is already continued to evolve from initially at independence, heavy centralization, then a few decades later going into some kind of deconcentration. And today we're seeing now a more focus on devolution. So I'll take each one of these and go in a little more detail now that I've given you the kind of a synopsis of it. So pre-colonial, before the violent enforcement of European systems of governance in Africa, governance in Africa was generally and relatively decentralized. So although there were some fairly heavily centralized systems and kingdoms, by far the majority as compared to Asia were heavily decentralized. Africans tended to cluster around what you might call clan type nations, and those small nations would in some instances amalgamate into bigger kingdoms, although the individual nations could actually be based on different language and so on, but the broader what you might call world views and customs would be generally the same. And as these kingdoms grew bigger, of course, elements of centralization would also increase. But you'll find where I differ with some of the European scholars, especially they somehow misconstrue the African kingdoms as monarchs, which they experienced in Europe. So the European monarch was very, very different from the African kingdom. In that the European monarchs were ultimately driven at the top by personal power of the emperors and others. So actually it was easy, say for an English king to get up in the morning and just order that his wife gets killed, and it's done. Go and invade that country and it's done. That's how, because those kingdoms were built on brute force. The African kingdoms differed in a sense that they always relied on highly decentralized systems and highly participatory processes. So even at the village level, you'd have councils and consultative processes all the way up to the top. There are some instances where, of course, they behave like European monarchs, but in general, it was not like that. So that's the pre-colonial period. When we get into the colonial period, now we see the enforcement of the Eurocentric mode, next slide, mode of government into the African countries. We have lost the slides there, so I'll go on to my own slides unless it comes back. Let me know when the slide is back. So I'll move. I'll have to move to my manual system here. So if you look at after colonization, as you may recall, the European countries used slightly different methods, but in the end, it was more or less and same result. The British used both direct and indirect rule. The French used mostly direct rule and used the system of assimilation. Meanwhile, the Portuguese also used direct rule, the Comprador. The Germans also direct rule. But you find that the British, for instance, in their use of both direct and indirect rule, it was mostly driven by commercial interests and business interests, because they would register a company each. The Queen would authorize a chartered company, which would then go and actually run a kind of colonial system, either direct or indirectly. So, for instance, in East Africa, you had the British, the Imperial British East Africa Company, and the Royal Niger Company for West Africa. In my part of the country, Zimbabwe, with the British South Africa Company. And these companies were commercial companies. Like in my own country, Zimbabwe, that company ruled this country from 1890 to 1925. That's almost 35 years as a company, before it became a British self-ruling, self-administered colony. So you can see that the colonialists initially were not establishing a system of governance for the purposes of what you might call citizen development, territorial justice, and so on. It was for commercial purposes. Next slide, please. So once again, let me not belabor the point. I can see that there is a lot of detail in these slides. You're going to be able to see the slides later. But the important thing is, on the indirect rule, you have like the British system, which I'm most familiar with. There are lots of states which were protectorates. So there was not direct rule per se. States like Botswana, Swaziland, Lesotho, and so on, Zanzibar. So what would happen is that the kind of local traditional authorities would kind of continue to be in place, but reporting to a small number of European authorities, governors, or advisors of some kind. So that's how the British in particular differentiated your direct from indirect rule. So they would, and I'm quoting here the UK Prime Minister Salisbury explaining why it was important in some instances to offer indirect rule. And I quote, "The condition of a protected dependency is more acceptable to the half-civilized races and more suitable for them than direct domination or dominion. It is cheaper, simpler, less wounding to their self-esteem, gives them more career as public officials, and spares of unnecessary contact with the white man." So this is the kind of thinking, can you imagine? So I could go on and on, but I would go on to the next slide for you to understand the indirect rules still operated on the idea that the local system had to be reconfigured just to serve their interests. Are we on this next slide? Or I'm in the, I'm forgetting I'm in my own slides. I can see I'm still in my own slides. Okay, so if we then basically go on to the period of the Second World War, the so-called Second World War. It was really a European war, but they called it a world war. And if you go back to the period leading to the conclusion of the Second World War, they even as the Second World War was raging, once I'm quoting here Franklin D. Roosevelt communicating with the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, making it clear that this is the so-called Atlantic Charter, where they were recognizing that after the war, things are going to have to change. There is absolutely no way the colonial system was going to continue the way it was. And that's why, even Macmillan, after the Second World War, spoke about the winds of change. He was really just echoing the Atlantic Charter that somehow the colonial powers had to start respecting the rights of all peoples, and that those peoples had the right to choose their own form of governance. But you can also see that the attempts to continue to dominate the previously colonized countries was already beginning to be in place. So the kind of neo-colonial agenda was already starting even before these countries, our countries in Africa became independent. But the Second World War took a huge toll on the European powers. That war was expensive, and the Americans, of course, made a killing from it. But for the European powers, they could no longer afford to just carry all these colonial African countries. They had to start devolving in their own way by giving independence to these African countries. So that's why we find that when decolonization really started legally, earnestly in the mid-50s, with Ghana being the first one to be fully independent, as it went all the way up to some say 1975 if you're thinking of Namibia, some will say 1994 if you think South Africa was still really not an independent African country until Mandela became president. So that entire period, that whole entire period was a period of decolonization. And the countries that got independence area went through a full cycle of evolution, which we're not going to talk about in this session, but definitely the handover was not always peaceful. So if we were talking about the transition from colonization to independent, although it varied, it mostly had a bit, was marred with some political violence, unrest, organized revolts, because even when it was obvious that the European countries had to hand over, they actually had somehow to hang on. And it's difficult to figure out how to hand over power. It's always difficult. And some like the Portuguese were worse than others. The Portuguese would just, they would just kill the government, kill the civil service, the public administration. They pull out even the toilet seats as they left. So it was all different. So which means that transition in the first few years after colonial governments was tough, because you still had to run this Western style type of government, but at the same time trying to figure out how you're going to actually be self-determining, self-reliant. So you can actually see the seeds of neo-colonialism are being sown, and we're going to see how that impacts on the potential for devolution in Africa. So immediately after independence, most African countries, if not all, had to centralize power, because now you had a conglomeration of different clans and ethnic groups and other dissatisfied groups, including in the urban areas, a new class of, if you want, trade unionists, etc. And to really put it crudely, it became important for the newly independent governments who had fought for independence to actually do exactly what the colonials had to do, and that is try and hold together this false nation into what may one day be a real nation by centralizing power. And almost every government had to centralize power, because you were running an illegitimate system you took over, and now you were trying to make it legitimate, but by one, ensuring that there's no state collapse completely, but you hold things together and then hopefully try and build a new nation after that. So after centralization, which was pushed mostly as a guise for national unity and also for central planning, we're being told this is how to develop. So the initial thrust of our independence government, of no fault of their own initially, was really to try and centralize and hold everything together. And that with almost without exception, it didn't take much. If you look at almost every African government, after the euphoria of the first few years, by the end of the first decade, it becomes clear that centralization is not going to do the job. things are not working completely well. There's no real economy because there was never really any kind of one national economy holding together agriculture and industrialization, or the industrialization process was false. It was a colonial model. And then governments struggling to hold at the center. And then the pressure to decentralize started building up. And you can go into the literature, put some of the stuff here. You can see how almost every government, without exception, after the first decade or two, to seriously start figuring out how to decentralize power, even before we talk about full devolution. So if we fast track to the last 2 decades or so, there's more talk about devolution, not just decentralization. Devolution has become the more popular idea of where each country wants to go, and as a result, in fact, that's why DWP thought this is an important topic for us to focus on, because if and when Africans really figure out this issue of decentralization, then that may also ultimately even inform how we put together a one Africa. Even the way the Africa Union is put together today is a reflection of how our national levels of government are put together. So you have a weak Africa Union, but it is increasingly strengthening, but very far from where it ought to be, until we really figure out how to industrialize our countries and how to devolve power to a point where the roots are strong, and not just the center of government, but the entire economy, the entire society is strong. So the departure points for future discussion that I want to put on the table is that given that the evolution of devolutionary tendencies from pre-colonial to contemporary today are not fully, I mean, it's happening. So it's trying to shoot a moving target. Our scholars are researching. It's very interesting. I mean, you should just look at how African scholars are doing a brilliant job of trying to grapple with this in each and every country. I was able to find scholars and activists who are grappling with this issue. But there's a lot of research, a lot of debate that needs to happen to sharpen this, and that's why DWP focused on this issue. So once again, I sum up the departure points. Development is what most people are looking for in devolution. The impact of improving service delivery from the center to another, at least 2 layers of government. Improved governance systems is another important departure point. Enhancing participation, democracy to the level that the African worldview of the past envisaged. At village level, you had deeply democratic participatory processes. You didn't need to go to the police to resolve many of the issues today that you have to look for a lawyer or a court to deal with. And then finally, kind of the fiscal issue keeps coming back as a departure point. How can we improve not just the raising of the fiscus to run government, but how to actually industrialize the economy, that as devolution happens, economic activity, you have one economy. You go into a village, is the same economy that is interacting with the centralized urban economy. So when we say improved service delivery, we're talking about the need to rationalize the roles and responsibilities between central government and the devolved sub-national levels. It has to, it's almost like a developmental state idea that we are recasting the entire state machinery from top to bottom for development, for local economic development. And therefore becomes easier to figure out how to finance the sub-national governments. So it is important in this debate, and there are a number of scholars whom I hope are going to also volunteer to speak on this series, to really, because this relationship between decentralization and service delivery is quite complex, and the results are mixed, and we would like to hear from serious experts why this may be the case. So success, once again, if you look at the literature, is being experienced where some of these functions are clearer, division of labor between central and local government, and where capacity at local level has been developed to handle these issues, including financial issues. But without a strong legal framework, which hangs everything together, it's difficult. And once again, in almost every country, even when we see attempts to have a strong legal framework, the closer you get to the rural areas and the ground, the more the European laws, which are still in place, clash with the African laws. So therefore, I had to ask the question for the experts and yourselves to debate and answer. Does devolution therefore lead to development? So I started by looking at what the literature says beyond Africa. And if you see the emergence of newly industrialized nations such as China and India has brought this to the fore. There is an increasing belief that countries such as these were able to industrialize at the pace, especially China, because of decentralization, because of the capacity then to have one economy with capacity from village all the way up to state, provincial, national level to push processes of mass production, which are organized mass processing of products in manufacturing and mass consumption of improved goods and services. Therefore, when you look at China and the United States, the two most powerful economies in the world, the political worldviews they could never be further apart. Yet they both have developed highly decentralized systems. You go to the United States, all the way down to the county level. What happens there in terms of public administrative capacity is amazing. Some of you recall when Al Gore lost the election to George Bush, and the whole world, the United States itself, was all waiting for one little county in Florida to finish its own process of highly legally framed electoral laws and process before it could decide who won the election in their county, and that was going to decide who was going to be the president. You go to China, all the way to village level, the level of leadership, administrative process, the ability at village level to understand the national vision and work in unison with it, capacity to deal with central government, capacity to deal with foreign investors at village level. So two completely different societies with different worldviews, with the Americans drumming their own idea of what democracy is. And the Chinese not even talking about democracy. They a meritocratic system which has been sharpened over the time to be able to have the best of the best surface at all levels of government. Two completely different systems, but both delivering high levels of service delivery and performance because they have decentralized, they've devolved the appropriate powers to the right level effectively. So once again, I will leave it at that for the purposes of discussion. So the fiscal issue I've talked about, I was going probably into much detail. I think I'll leave that for the real experts to talk about later. But I would encourage you to read my own little book, which was published by Penguin Books in 2010, Leading Africa, where I actually talk about the problem we have in Africa is that we took government from the colonials. And up until today, we are trying to build strong governments, and it is taking all our efforts. We don't have time to focus on building strong communities, so that we somehow think we can build strong governments based on weak families and weak communities. So it's like, I'm going to have the most beautiful roof on this building, although the foundation is only 6 inches deep. It's not possible. It's so. Let us just use pure common sense. How can Africa build a strong, advanced society? How can we build strong economies or strong governments in the end, where these families and communities are weak and actually getting weaker by the day and decaying? So this is my issue with leadership at all levels, not just political leadership, including intelligentsia, including our experts, including our scholars. We are unable to deal. This is a blind spot for us. We are just too busy trying to build the center, for the center to hold. We can't build the periphery. So it's a tough one. It makes life easy for the colonials and the post-colonials. It's easy to come in and just cherry pick what they want to deal with us and access our heads of states and other powerful people, because it's difficult to have strong government when the periphery is weak. It's building the house backwards, starting with the roof. So territorial development in the end is what is needed to build comparative advantage of the periphery. If there's no economic comparative advantage at local authority and village level, if there's no social comparative advantage, if there's no environmental comparative advantage, then there's no comparative advantage at all, because at village level or at decentralized level, all the key functions are not possible. You won't have the people and capacity to plan, whether it's fiscal planning, development planning, financial activities, investment, regulatory functions. All these things require strong periphery, strong subnational governments. So in conclusion, I would say I kind of framed key issues which I think are important for this dialogue over the next 6 weeks. We need to rationalize the roles and the sharing of roles and responsibilities and mandates between central government and the devolved subnational governments. Service delivery is a big one. It's complex. We need people who can unpack it. In the literature, I was amazed to find an interesting debate, and I hope some of those experts will come along, debates between actually using good examples outside the countries, so that we may have some good case studies coming. But elected councils performing better than appointed authorities. So it was a very interesting one for me to follow, because it's a mixed bag. You find in some countries, democratic elections at local levels, at decentralized levels, but an increase in corruption. In some instances, you have appointed, and there's also an increase. Then you got a very opposite, where appointed officials are performing better than elected officials. So it's very, for Africa, we need to debate this issue so that we are not just pushed into the idea that democracy leads to accountability and performance. So these are some of the issues. I'm hoping to for us to have speakers join us with real case studies by country and so on. And I look forward to a vibrant, healthy, and highly fruitful debate dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof, for that informative presentation. We now open up the floor to anybody with questions. Please use the hand reaction emoji and we'll unmute you. For those who want the PowerPoint presentation, I've sent the email address in the chat. You can just email us and we'll send you the PowerPoint presentation. Thank you. Any questions or contributions? Joshua?
Good evening, folks. Mandi, thanks a lot for this provocative discourse on devolution. I just wanted to make a comment to say that I'm sure in the chapters to come, in the next few discussions, we might have an opportunity to unpack what we might call an evaluation matrix to say, when do we think devolution is successful? Is it successful because a particular location now says it's in control, or 60% of its fiscus, or 70%, or so that we bring up some of those issues And the other issues like the demand for devolution, from whence is it coming from? Is it from the center or is it from the bottom? And because oftentimes you do find that the center might find devolution a sweet language to use, but it might not necessarily meet the exact situation that the periphery is looking for. I think these comments might be answered today, but they could be also be food for thought for the sessions to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Any other questions or contributions? Dr. Ungwe?
Unmute. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to say that I want to follow up on what Josh has said. That's actually was that's the thing that always intrigues me. That a lot of the casual discussion we have about devolution government. I mean, if you meet any group of people, the conversation quickly channels itself towards politics and power and development and everything. And I just wanted to emphasize the point that I haven't seen the unpacking of in whose interest is the devolution, because until we can understand that, we will not see the drivers for it. And the interest may be varied, as Prof has just said, but if we can unpack the interests and how we can manipulate those interests, then I think we might be able to channel the devolution to the interest of the general public. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ungwe, for that. Apologies for our network. We're having some challenges with our network, so please bear with us. Prof, would you like to respond or add to those two questions?
This is actually both questions at the heart of what needs to be unpacked. So you see, they're also both chicken and egg type of questions. That is why we are in the situation we are in Africa. So if Josh, Dr. Nyoni is asking the question, so how do you unpack the evaluation matrix? So I would say if you look at the debates and as they rage, they fall into two. The framework would be split into two, as far as I could see. There's the why and then there's the how. So when you look at the why do I want devolution? Why should you'll find that the emphasis is on the political mandate and the extent to which political power is shared with lower echelons of society. So, and at its extreme, it's not interested in the how, because before the why is answered, they're not even going to focus on the how. They just want you to devolve the power. Just allow the lower levels to have as much power as we can to decide on things, because the more political power is devolved to provincial or state, and then below that, then it means that policies can be made at subnational levels, which means laws can be made and bylaws, and then administrative policy can be reformed at those levels. And when administrative policy is adjusted, it then means that all the administrative functions, including fiscal, can be locally determined. And more importantly, the judicial function can also be influenced locally, because if you can make local laws and bylaws, or even influence national ones, because you have enough power to influence the national laws as a subnational government, then it actually means that you have impact on the system of justice, the judicial aspect. So, but the point, Josh, is that the debate, what you were talking about as the evaluation matrix won't have one framework, because you have both sides. You have those who just emphasize the why it has to. You just give me the power. Don't ask me why I need the power. And if you recall, I was experiencing some of this in Zimbabwe, South Africa, especially Namibia, when it comes to the land issue. So people who are on the other side of the evaluation matrix would say it's more about the how. Is it improving service delivery? Are we improving fiscal performance? Josh, you see, when you're on that side of the thing, there's less emphasis on the political why. So if the example I'm giving you on the land, you go to South Africa today, the society will never be agreed at any level. From top to bottom, you're going to have enough part of society which says, don't ask me why do I need land? Give me the land, because I never had it. What I do with the land is none of your business. Then you'll have others who say, no, why should we distribute the land? When we think that by not over redistributing it, we can have better economic efficiency, better this efficiency. So devolution is a bit like that. There are some who will emphasize in your evaluation matrix the political aspects and not really even focus in some instances on the functional aspects, because it becomes more important for people to enjoy, to just feel and know that we have enough of our devolved political power to make our own policies, our own laws, and influence the judicial functions of society. So this also goes into Dr. Ungwe's question, in whose interest? There are so many interests. And the colonial system made sure that for that 100 or so years they were around, there will never be one effect. They divide and rule, whether through indirect rule or direct rule. They made sure the society they left behind would take decades to be able to have what you might call collective self-interest. So always, if you're looking for answers as to in whose interest, you're going to have 100 answers. There are going to be so many different interests that they don't end up to a national vision. And that is why I was going through the evolution of this whole thing. The colonial state, as it was breaking down, and we're having independent government, without exception, the new government of Africans who fought for independence would actually install more centralization of government. Why? The interest is to have the state machinery to continue function. At least you can't have a colonial government hand over independence to you. The next thing, that the state collapses. So there is what it takes for the state to continue running is much more than what the colonials left, because they didn't leave you an economy. They didn't leave you a system of public administration, which is self-sustaining. But now you struggle to almost every African country after independence had to centralize. So the idea that soon after independence, you're going to find easily collective self-interest is become very elusive. In fact, collective self-interest was only highly visible before independence. Africans, both at national level and at continental level, were more united before independence than after independence. Because before independence, they had collective self-interest to kick out the colonial government. And that's how the Organization of African Unity was formed in every African country, even where politically we may have differed, but we all eventually agreed and came together that we had to boot out the colonial regime. After they were booted out, there has not been any easy way forward in finding collective self-interest. So decentralization has come not because governments are nice, not because political parties are nice. In my opinion, decentralization, if you look at the literature, has slowly happened because within a decade after independence, it becomes clear the center is not going to hold. You have to give away something because the center has no capacity. It does not have the fiscal resources, the capacity, the economy is not there. And you have to devolve somehow. You have to give up some power. And then that decongestion happens. Then as that goes on, and this is where I think we are now, where we have enough stability after 1994, very clear stability of African nations, much more clear and much better, if you want, coherence as to what kind of political systems may work for us, what kind of economic management systems may work for Africa. There's greater consensus amongst Africans after 1994. And that's why it was eventually possible to create, to move from Organization of African Unity to Africa Union, because Africans could now see the possibility of really eventually creating one Africa. So we are not, we are only getting into the aspects of devolution as collective self-interests, maybe 1 or 2 decades down the road, in my opinion. And once again, if you look at the newly industrialized countries like China and India, they took a long time, a very long time to reach a point where you'd say now collective self-interest was so clear at a high level that you could now have one nation and a centralized government with enough stability to run the economy. So I hope that the other experts and speakers down the road will dig more into these types of issues. Over back to you, moderator.
Thank you very much, Prof. Any more questions or contributions? Please use the hand reaction emoji and we'll unmute your microphone. Dr. Hungwe.
Sorry to appear to be monopolizing the whole thing, but I find this very interesting because where I am and I'm also where I've traveled. One of the things that I found lacking all over Africa is in the area of services in urban areas. And I've often wondered how you can get consensus amongst the residents on how to solve some of these things and how central government can devolve some of the responsibilities down to the local communities, because surely I think they must have an idea of what is good for them. When some of the residential areas have never had piped water for years and garbage has not been collected for years, one begins to wonder how you can structure the community so that they are locally responsive to their own needs and effectively manage themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hungwe, for that. Any other questions or contributions?
Hello.
Nyari?
Yeah, thank you very much. I have a question. As a young person, I really wanted to know what the devolution process involves. How, as a young person, I can be able to get my concerns through to the people that matter and be able to get things sorted out, for example, in my community or maybe in my city or something like that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nyari. Any more questions or contributions? Kudzaishe?
Yes, thank you very much for the very insightful presentation, Prof. My question is on the fact that we are looking at how institutions in Africa, that are in Africa, are pushing to develop Africa from a collective point. and you're citing that the governments around AU might not be strong enough to, but as we look at Africa industrializing, we are looking at a future where the collective interest of pushing for transformation of Africa is going to be more visible. And my question now is, how do we facilitate, or how do we, I like the issue that I want to follow up on Dr. Hongwe to say, if we're able to develop a matrix on how these countries or success stories on devolution have worked, and now how do we facilitate operationalization or the functional part of devolution from a participatory angle to drive industrialization, not without the conditions that have been set by the colonial master? Is there a matrix or a way we can say, if this is done, it will capacitate African governments, not starting right from their communities or from their local provincial levels, to be able to operationalize capacity building and participatory, irrespective of the conditions that are depriving Africa or some of these nations? Is there a way of saying, irrespective of these circumstances that have drawn Africa into such negativity or the decaying state like you were presenting, is there a way that we can say these conditions are immune to the conditions that are prevailing and depriving Africa of its success or its needful move to devolution, to devolve power and governance for its transformation? Is there a way we can come up to now say, this, if this is done, then it superimposes, or it actually immune to the effects of what the damage that has been done before? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. Because of time, Prof will respond, and then we'll take another round of questions, and then we'll close off the session. So over to you, Prof.
Oh, thanks, moderator. I'll start by answering Kuzaisha's question, because it gives me the the foundation to respond to the earlier questions. So, Kuzaisha, Philip, you see, and please don't get me wrong, because each time I speak the way I'm going to speak, I may also be misconstrued as being a little crude or arrogant. But at my age, I better say things as they are, because I'm not going to be here for as long as you. I can tell you, I know you're much younger. So listen, the thing is that there is no single African country whose structure of the economy is capable of producing a federal state. Let me repeat that again. Every single African country, including South Africa, does not have a structure of the economy which is sufficiently decentralized in the way it industrializes to be able to have strong subnational governments. So you go to our strongest economy, South Africa, even a provincial government cannot survive. It has to rely on central government, never mind local authorities, because like every other African country, they're in a middle income trap where you're only kind of a wealthy nation because of very limited capacity for a local domestic market. There's no sufficient numbers of people we're earning enough resources to really be able to sustain a fully industrializing nation, because that's how the colonials set it up. The colonials set it up so that you continue to be unable to fully industrialize your nations. One, because you don't have the domestic market. The rural market is not connected to the urban market. So sooner or later, you're going to be relying on imports where you could be industrializing and manufacturing for yourself. So even in South Africa, the strongest economy, the local authorities are not functioning, Dr. Ungwe. So it's not a matter of incapacity of people or corruption. All those things are important. Lack of capacity, corruption, of course, minimize the possibility of good service delivery. But that's not the most important reason. The most important reason is that there is no small town in Zimbabwe or South Africa or Ethiopia or Kenya which is economically viable. Okay. Only 1 or 2 cities, even in South Africa, are economically viable, meaning they have enough citizens, or in the case of cities, we call them, what you can't remember the proper term. You don't have enough ratepayers in your devolved cities to be able to finance a municipality or a municipal system which can provide the services that Dr. Ungwe is talking about. So you want to see garbage being collected, water flowing through the pipes every single day, every month, every hour, every year. You want to see electricity flowing. And when that does not happen, the system is set up so that you blame the local authority. But you are only analyzing the problem at one level. And as I've said before, these are problems in Africa you have to analyze at 5 levels. If you only analyze at event and trend level, this is what's happening. Why is water not coming through my pipe? The power goes and never comes back for 2 days. Sometimes I didn't even know, they can't even tell us when it's going to come back. These are events. These are not structures or systems that you're analyzing. You're analyzing events which you may combine into trends or whatever. But what you're not analyzing is who created the system that's failing and what mental model were they using? Now, if you find that the mental model and the vision that created that mental model was a colonial one, it was never intended to have many, many towns, an economy which will produce so many municipalities which are self-sustaining. The relationship between a faraway village and its own town is so powerful economically, they don't need a centralized state, city like Harare or Johannesburg or Nairobi to generate fiscus to devolve down to the county and down to the rural district council. They are able to levy their own taxes because the economy at that level is functioning well. So I would say, Dr. Ungwe, it's easy to blame the victim because take your own country, Zimbabwe. There's no single viable town. There's no single viable, even urban authority. The smaller ones, like Kwekwe, Mutare, Masvingo, were never economic. To start with anyway, it was only 2, Bulawayo and Harare. So the Chegutus and Chinois were never economic towns. So how do you expect them to have the number of ratepayers who can then put the fiscus into that municipality to provide the services that are needed? Even in South Africa, there are probably just 3 cities which are economically viable. The Gauteng region, Cape Town, and Durban. The rest really are dependent on the state machinery to survive. So you see people toying in South Africa because of poor service delivery down the road, and it's subscribed to corruption and poor administration. Yes, those are factors, but that's not the primary strategic reason. The primary strategic reason is those were established by colonials as administrative centers. They were never developed those towns as manufacturing towns, which can be economically viable. So I'm sorry to say that the devolution debate has to not just focus on what I'm calling the event and trend, a matrix of evaluation that Dr. Nguyen was talking about. The evaluation matrix has to go to the 5 levels. Okay, evaluate poor service delivery, but also evaluate the systems and structures in place. Would they actually be able to create a viable subnational government or local authority? And I'm sorry to say that so far, the answer is, in most cases, even you put the best people in the world, take them from China, take them from the United States, and put them in those municipal systems, slight improvement, they will still collapse because the economy is not structured to have viable, independent economic local authorities. It's restructuring the entire thing. That's my opinion. Now I'm giving you my personal opinion. on these last set of questions. And I would be quite happy to hear alternative voices from other scholars, because really I'm going for the jugular. I'm going for what I think are the highest strategic issues that we're not talking about. And as a result, we end up focusing on the political issues, which are easier, and blame everything to corruption and maladministration. And as I've said before, yes, 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 but show me one country which is not full of corrupt people. It's just a different type of corruption. They have been able to manage their corruption. They've been able to regulate it. They've been able to create developmental state machineries which can produce development, and corruption is out there. In fact, they have got much more billions and trillions going through a corrupt system, but is invisible because the economies are so big, whilst we end up with ours chewing money that is in the public system, and it's much more visible. But the end result is, at all levels of analysis, we are too far focused on the lower end of the issues and not at the strategic end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. We'll take one more round of questions before we bring our session to an end. Any more questions or contributions? We have a question here. Is it possible to effectively have devolution and still push a united Africa agenda of all sorts as is promoted by the AU and some African political interests? That's a question for you, Prof.
Yes, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, you can go ahead, Prof.
I should start by apologizing to Nyari, because I should have answered him much more directly. I answered him indirectly through my long-winded response to Philip and Dr. West's questions, because I think Nyari's question requires more focus even in subsequent sessions, because I find our younger generations are really trying to figure out, and I think that's where the question is coming from, what the heck is going on? I mean, maybe, I hope, Nyari, I hope you're getting tired of blaming us, the older generation, because that's what I used to do when I was your age. We just blamed the older generation. And then when you get to be part of the older generation and you are part of the problem, that's when, speaking personally, I started to realize that part of the problem is that our whole educational system wastes your time, Nyari, from the moment you go to nursery school all the way to university. We promise you things that don't exist. We prepare you for a world that does not exist, because we are still really basically running a colonial. We're still living a dream that was left behind by the colonials. We have no idea of our own, how to industrialize our own continent based on African economic principles of mass participation in mass production and aggregation, and then mass processing them in the village, even in the townships that were left behind, so that we are consuming our own products. That's really the simplicity of the kind of mindset that, in my opinion, is to exist if the young people are going to transform the economy. So for you as a young person, you should look, in my opinion, at your nearest small town. I don't know what it is. Let's, for argument's sake, it's Marondera, if you are Zimbabwean, and ask the question, from the village I am at, or township that I'm staying, how could I stimulate and support processes that make it possible for rural people who are producing whatever it is you're producing, whether it's crops or livestock or herbs or what? How can we continue to produce these in ways that make it possible to add value to them right closer to where we produce them, so that we create our own manufacturing processes what the Chinese call proto-industrialization. There is no CSO for the Chinese and the Indians. There is no informal sector. This is a creation, it's a colonial mindset. They're calling it informal because they expect you to have an economy that is today the same as what they produced in London 200 years ago. But what Asians figured out is no, every industrializing nation starts from understanding how rural people will mass produce their product and start adding value to it and start manufacturing in the village and township. Never mind before you get to the big cities. And consume our own products. Your growth point produces locally manufactured products. But today you see the opposite. You go into a village, people are consuming imported products, including food that can be produced locally. So that's why COVID was a big blessing for Africans, but we continue to lose the opportunity. This was our opportunity to realize that most of the things we think are valuable are not valuable, because value is what we give. There's nothing that is inherently variable. Value is given by us. It's an internal thing. It's not an external thing. Because a Mercedes-Benz can be of high value to me, but for a God-hearing somebody in the Himalaya mountains, it's worth nothing. So, but changing the mindset as to what we give value to. So the youngsters of today, you have to learn from the mistakes we made, Nyari, and tell yourselves, if anything is manufactured from maize, if it's manufactured from soybean, if it's manufactured from sorghum, I won't import it. I will attempt to manufacture it locally, so that that idea escalates all the way up to government level, where the government now itself says, well, maize is not just for eating and for animal feed. There's 10, 15 other products you can make from maize. Once you understand the line of sight, the number of products you can make from maize, the number of products you can make from sorghum, the number of products you can manufacture from sesame, now you begin to understand that the products you are importing are made from the same products you're producing, but you're not manufacturing. You don't need to manufacture a lot of the product. When you import dog biscuits, you're importing maize and a bit of soybean and a little bit of meat. So what the heck? So this lack of connection between rural economy and manufacturing economy is what makes our towns non-economic. So if your town is Marondera, then you see you're not manufacturing anything, nothing. So how can you be a viable little town? And you in the village, you're trying to support your town, but there's no way to supply your product. You don't even know the number of products that can be made from the maize you're producing. You just think it's 2 products. So anyway, that's a long-winded response to you, Nyari, to basically say that change your mindset about how to build and industrialize our economy. We thought it was continuing to do what the colonials did. Big mistake. You change it around like the Malaysians did, like the Chinese did, like Indians are doing, the Vietnamese and others. So in terms of, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that Africans know that we are going to be stronger when we are one Africa. We all know that. And we know that the 1,000 different languages, the 1,000 different, what you might call cultural things that may differentiate us are much, much smaller in significance when you compare that to the similarities we have as Africans. Once again, if you read my little book, Being African, also published by Penguin, you'll find that the similarities are far more significant. That's why before colonization, we would fight and compete. And as soon as we fought different groups speaking different languages, integration would soon happen. So that's why there was no genocide. But the same people were fighting will sooner be marrying in across, and we've got the same broad world views, and integration was easy. So today, the only reason why we are slow in integrating our economies is because we are building an Africa Union, which we should, and I'm not saying we should slow that down, based on individual nation states which are weak. So if you've got 55 states which are not self-sustaining, whose economies are not industrialized, it's obvious that you're going to have an Africa Union which is going to be sponsored by the same colonials that you tried to put out 40, 50 years ago, because you can't pull enough resources from your own economies to have a self-determined Africa Union. So I am not trying to blame the victim. I'm actually saying we're trying to blame the victim. The Africa Union knows that it would be much stronger if it was financing itself. So the decentralization we are talking about is in effect the same opposite force that this last question about political will and capacity to unite Africa. It's like saying it would be more important for the Africa Union to worry less about the 101 things that it is trying to put in place than to just focus on one or two very important things, such as how do we figure out how to fully industrialize each and every country and support them to do so, and build strong communities and family structures which are active in mass production of raw materials and manufacturing, creating our own jobs, and ensuring that Africans don't continue to import all the nonsense rubbish we import from industrialized nations, which we don't need. We're addicted to foreign currency because we need to import even rice, basic things, like I say. So I would say the Africa Union would be stronger if it was more of a powerful strategic think tank, making it possible to then help each and every individual government to figure out a pathway from continual dependency on your former colonial masters to building our own independent economies, which will then build not just stronger governments, but those same 55 governments will build a stronger African Union. Like I said before, then it would just take 5 minutes of discussion at an Africa Union General Assembly to say every one of the 55 heads of states votes for one simple resolution, which says, to the rest of the world, an injury to one African by you people is an injury to all of us Africans, and you'll hear from us. We won't allow you to do business on this continent. We won't make it easy. It will then mean finally we have a real Africa, one Africa, a real strong Africa, which no one is going to mess around with. The reason why all these African Americans are harassed every day and killed by the police, we have Africans being harassed all over the world, treated like, we can't have our diaspora people have peace of mind, because we on the continent are not doing our job. We are not thinking enough. We are doing a lot, working hard, but not thinking enough towards how we create self-sustaining families, communities, nations. So the decentralization agenda should be how to increase comparative advantage from the center to the bottom so that you have strong society. And when you have 55 strong societies in one Africa Union, this is the most powerful force in the world. There's no other region in the world which can put 55 countries together. This is the biggest continent physically, and when the 55 eventually speak with one voice, no region, not even Asia, is 55 countries. Okay, so I like this last question, and I hope one of the speakers, or the gentleman who asked the question, would like to speak about it. Talk to this one. It may not happen in my own lifetime, but I know the youngsters like Nyari are going to figure it out. They're going to figure out that all the human species emanated from Africa. And ultimately, it's going to be this, it's the center of origin. So ultimately, this is going to be the most powerful continent in the world once we wake up. That's why we coined this whole series, Decentralization. Attempts to reawaken this sleeping giant, because if we can figure it out and create these strong subnational governments, which in turn can sponsor a strong national government, we will become unstoppable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof, for that. And this brings the close to our session. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. Please email us if you want a copy of the PowerPoint presentation and any other past presentations which have been done at at dialoguewithprof.com. And do visit our social media platforms on YouTube to check out our previous sessions and any other future sessions. Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us. And don't forget, this is a 6-part series, so it'll be running for the next 6 weeks. We've got various guests who are going to be joining us over the course of this series. And please just watch out for our notifications, and we'll hope to be seeing you again. Thank you very much, and good night.